John Brent was engaged in the unromantic occupation of mixing mortar with a hoe on the plains of Dakota. As Brent worked at the mud, his partner George Wentworth was in the bush nearby cutting sticks with which, in conjunction with the mud, they intended to build the chimney of the cabin they had just completed. The bending over was very tiring, and John straightened himself up with a sigh to rest for a moment. An astonishing sight met his eyes. So astonishing was it that he rubbed the moisture from them and looked again. A skeleton sat on the stump looking at him, if the eyeless sockets can be said to look, and on the fallen log beside the stump sat a second skeleton, with its skull resting in its bony hands, an attitude that reminded him oddly of his friend Wentworth. "Hello," cried Brent, when he had somewhat recovered from his surprise. "Who are you?" "I am your own skeleton, John," answered the apparition. "Don't you know me?" "Can't say that I've ever had the pleasure of seeing you before," replied John. Then, feeling the bone of his arm, he continued, "And now that I do see you, I don't believe in you. My skeleton is in its place all right enough." "Well, perhaps I am hardly justified in saying that I am your actual skeleton, but you know queer things happen on the plains. Perhaps you have seen a mirage since you came out?" "Yes, well, I am what you may call a mirage if you're a real skeleton. Understand?" "Yes, I think I do. But this is so unusual, don't you know, that I hardly. Say, would you have any objection to my calling my friend Wentworth?" "I haven't. Perhaps his own skeleton here would like to have a talk with him." Then, turning to the other spectre, the first said, "Say, George, how is that? Do you want to see your—" The other skeleton, without looking up, merely shook his skull in a solemn way, and then the first turned to John and said, "No, he doesn't seem to care about having your friend here. He's a very reticent fellow, George is, and don't like a crowd." "Yes, I know he is. I mean his skeleton. I could hardly get him to come at all." "Well, is there anything particular that you wanted to say to me? I presume you did not take all this trouble for nothing." "No, I wanted to know if you realized that you were mixing with that mortar." "I know there are a good many things that ought to be in it that are not in it. We can't get any lime out here, you know." "Do you know what you are mixing in place of lime?" "Yes, sand and water, and all the clay I can get, which isn't much. I don't know of anything else." "Well, there is something else, and a very important ingredient, too. You are mixing your own life with that mud." "How can it be?" cried the young man. At that moment he heard his partner approaching. "George," he shouted, "do you see anything on that stump?" Wentworth looked with astonishment at his partner, then at the stump. "I see the stump," he said. As John himself looked at the stump, he noticed that the two figures had become very dim, and as he gazed, they entirely disappeared. "You're sure you noticed nothing?" "Nothing unusual. What's the matter with you, John? Not going to have a return of the fever, I hope?" "I don't know. Hope not. I think my head's not quite all right yet." Then he told his comrade what he thought he had seen. "The ghost wasn't far wrong," said Wentworth as he seated himself on the log from which his spectre had just disappeared. "The warning, I imagine, was allegorical. We are mixing our lives up with that mud and building it into the shanty and wasting it on these plains." "Don't do that, George," cried his companion sharply. "What, don't my sentiments suit you?" "I don't mean the sentiments, but the attitude. Don't sit with your head in your hands. That's exactly the way your skeleton sat. Keep your head up whatever trouble comes. And about the sentiments, as you call them, what's the use of them?" What's the use of anything for that matter? There you go again. Who wanted to come out here? I'm sure I wasn't wild for it. It was your idea. Far from the maddening crowd and all that sort of thing. Now I'm sure we're far enough, if that's any consolation, and yet you are not satisfied. Keep your head up. I insist on that. That wasn't in the Articles of Agreement, John. Well, it's in from now on. But now why are we here? What's the matter with all this sort of life? Isn't it what you expected? I suppose so. You can't expect Piccadilly out here, you know. If you yearn for the limitless plain, you can't have the limited Piccadilly, too. Oh, I don't know. William Black had green pastures in Piccadilly. We've got the green pastures, miles of them. Perhaps we shall have our Piccadilly when we make our fortunes at sheep raising. Well, this sort of talk will not build the chimney. Do you think you have sticks enough? Yes. All right, let's combine them. And they did. The sticks were laid in the form of a hollow square and plastered inside and out with the mud. 2. The blizzard. When John Brent came breathlessly into the shanty, a fierce blast of bitter cold swept into the room with him. It pushed vigorously at the door as he struggled to close it, and then rattled its frail framework against the stout bar that John put up to keep it shut. Brent threw his overcoat and wraps in a corner, came to the huge fire that was roaring in the open chimney. Good gracious, he cried. What a Christmas Eve this is. 15 degrees below zero at sunset, and Lord knows what now. Heavens and earth, George, sit up and don't keep your head in your hands that way. Don't you know what makes me nervous? I believe you do it purposely to make me low-spirited. Wentworth looked up wearily but said nothing. I don't believe, continued John, that there will be one of our sheep alive in the morning. Certainly not if this cold continues. I've done all I can for them, but nobody can stand it out there more than a few moments at a time. Don't trouble about the sheep, said Wentworth dejectedly. We shall be more than lucky if we come out of this alive ourselves. Indeed, I don't expect that we shall. I'll trust you for taking a lively view of things. If you have one merit more than another, George, it is a talent for cheerfulness under all circumstances. We shall never get out of this alive, John. It is getting colder all the time. I'm freezing here in spite of the big fire. It would actually be a pleasure to be burned to death. Nonsense. This sort of weather can't last long. It doesn't need to. We have a week's firewood piled up in here and more outside. We lived through it all right. Next Christmas we shall be in London. You bet your life. We have bet our lives now, and we have lost. Brent did not answer him. He looked with dismay at his friend. Wentworth sat with his chin in his hands, gazing at the roaring fire, and it seemed to Brent that the light of madness was in his eyes. All that day he had made no effort to help with the necessary work of the place, and Brent had uncomplainingly done everything that was required. Suddenly Wentworth started up and seized a blazing brand from the fire. With it burning, he started for the door. What are you going to do? Cried his comrade. I'm going to see how the thermometer stands. I wouldn't open that door if I were you. You would mind your own business, will you? Shouted Wentworth, facing around, with the blazing brand in his hand and glaring him with a look that chilled Brent more than the extreme cold. John said nothing, but stepped aside and let him pass. Wentworth, after a moment's pause, flung down the bar, and the door flew open. The wind, cutting like a razor, roared into the room and made even the strong fire seem a mockery. Wentworth held the red brand up against the little thermometer that hung on the outside, and Brent, looking over his shoulder, was appalled to see that it stood at 42 degrees below zero. Wentworth swayed from side to side and seemed unable to read the figures. At last the brand fell from his hand and he staggered into the room. Brent picked up the burning stick and, flinging it into the fire, closed the door again. Wentworth resumed his old attitude before the fire, shivering now and then. Brent put more wood on and then sat down. "How cold was it, John?" asked Wentworth mildly. He had apparently forgotten all about his rough remark. "About 40 below." "So much as that? And they told us that when it was 20 below, all wind stopped. Great heavens, how do they lie about this cursed country?" After a few minutes' silence, Wentworth suddenly sprang to his feet. "What was that, John?" he cried nervously. "Did you notice that?" "Notice what?" "Something was thrown down the chimney on the fire." "Nonsense," said Brett. "You had better go to bed." "There it is again!" As he spoke, a chunk fell into the center of the fire, then another and another. Brent's ruddy face paled as he realized what it was. The useless mud with which the chimney was built was crumbling with the heat and falling away, leaving the dry sticks bare to the flames. Before he could think of what was best to do, an ominous, sullen roar came down the chimney. Wentworth jumped to the door and threw it open. He laughed wildly and called to his dazed partner, "Look, John, look!" The landscape outside was lit up with the red glare of the burning shanty. The sight roused John from his stupor. "Come, George," he cried. "Let's get out what we can. You take the clothing and I'll carry out some provisions. This shanty won't last 10 minutes. "Of course it won't. You leave if you want to. This is my spot." "George, this is no time for nonsense. Help me out with things." "All right, here goes." He flung the clothing indiscriminately out of the shanty and then, without a word of warning, sprang on his partner and seized him by the throat. "Out of this, you cowardly hound," he yelled. "Out with the rest of the dunnage. This fire is for me. Out with you." The superhuman strength of the madman was something Brent was utterly unable to cope with. He was flung in a heap on the pile of clothing, and before he could rise to his feet, Wentworth was inside again and had the door barred. The roof was now one mass of flames. Brent seized a piece of wood and tried to batter in the door, but he could make no headway, and although the fire burned his face, the terrible blizzard benumbed his arms and made his efforts useless. Every time he struck the door, there was a yell of laughter from within that sounded above the roar of the flames and the blizzard. At last, there was a crash, and the roof fell in. Brent stood back with a groan of anguish and looked helplessly at the bonfire, from which there now came no human sound. He sat down on the stump and gazed hopelessly at the burning logs as they fell one by one into the mass of flames. Gradually, all sense of discomfort from the bitter cold left him. A soothed and pleasant feeling came over him. The flames seemed to grow dimmer and dimmer. Even the sense of regret and grief left him. "John," said a voice at his side. Brent turned around and saw sitting on the log beside him the second specter that he had beheld with wonder in the summer. This time, however, it did not seem to surprise him. "Well, what is it?" "John, I acted with unpardonable rudeness tonight. But you know, I was not in my right mind, or never would I have done so." "I knew that. Anyway, it doesn't seem to matter now." "No, it doesn't. Strange, isn't it? Such opposite elements. You by frost, I by fire. John, a Merry Christmas to you. Do you see the light breaking in the east?" Brent did not answer. "Come," said the specter. "You are ready now. Let us go."